Welcome to this taster lecture introducing the BA in the Archaeology of Egypt and Sudan. My name is Claudia Naeser. I'm the lecturer in Egyptian archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology at UCL. In September 2020, we will launch a new BA in the Archaeology of Egypt and Sudan. It builds on a long-standing, successful predecessor program, but adds the component Sudan to it. While Egypt is prominent in most people's perception, the new title begs the question, why Sudan? In this talk I will try to answer this question using an example from my own research. Let us start by looking at this image from Google Earth. It clearly shows the river oasis of the Nile, with the delta at the Mediterranean Sea in the north and the transition from the arid environment of the Sahara into the Sahel zone further south. But where is the border between Egypt and Sudan? Today we have a political border, but in the past things look different. Through all periods of human history, the Nile Valley attracted human populations. From around 3000 BC, the early Egyptian state developed in the northernmost section. But at the same time, complex societies also evolved in the areas further south. So we have a stretch of roughly 1000 kilometers, which becomes Pharaonic Egypt, and another stretch of about the same size in the Middle Nile Valley, which became the home of a series of late Stone Age, Bronze Age and Iron Age societies who lived in close contact with their northern neighbors. For a long time, this situation has been acknowledged in the archaeological study of the region. Since the mid-19th century, archaeologists explored both ancient Egypt and the culture south and their interactions. Ancient Egypt always stayed most prominent in the public perception, though. It's only very recently that many museums have started to challenge this bias. The British Museum was the first to rename its Egyptian department into Department of Egypt and Sudan. As you can see from this slide, other museums followed, such as the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, Manchester Museum, the Oriental Museum in Durham, and UCL's Petrie Museum. While the museums have implemented this turn, education has lagged behind. Now UCL is the first UK university to set up a degree which regularly teaches the archaeology of the entire Nile Valley. I claim that this has several advantages. It mirrors recent developments in archaeological research. Fieldwork in Sudan has seen a major boost over the last 3 decades and currently is one of the most vibrant archaeological scenes worldwide. But on top, our new BA also helps to widen the perspective, to get Egypt out of its corner of splendid historical isolation. Adding context allows us to more accurately investigate and understand also the trajectory of ancient pharaonic history, society, and culture. Now let's turn to details. I want to substantiate my points through the introduction of a fieldwork project which I conduct in, well, where exactly? In terms of political borders, the Shalfaq archaeological mission happens in Sudan, 50 kilometers south of the present-day borderline between Egypt and Sudan. But the site we study is an ancient Egyptian fortress. It was constructed about 1800 BC by Pharaoh Senusret III in a period which we call the Middle Kingdom. As you can see from the satellite image, our site, Shalfaq, is today situated on a small island in the middle of the reservoir lake of the Aswan Dam. In antiquity, what today is an island was a high promontory on the western riverbank, as this image simulates. The ancient Egyptian name of the fortress was Waf Khasud, which forces down the Khasud, the foreign lands. Waf Khasud was only one in a chain of 12 fortresses which the Middle Kingdom pharaohs constructed to create a frontier zone protecting Egypt from a perceived threat from the Kingdom of Kush, a contemporary polity in the Middle Nile Valley. The Middle Kingdom has been the focus of archaeological research for more than 100 years. Statues of Senusret III, who built Shalfaq, are exhibited in the Great Sculpture Gallery of the British Museum. Equally, the contemporary Kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Kerma, has seen extensive archaeological exploration since the early 20th century. Our interest is to deepen the understanding of the interaction between these two entities. We want to explore Egyptian expansion and imperial policy, but we also want to investigate the lived realities of the Egyptians stationed several hundred kilometers south of their homeland. The only previous archaeological project at Shalfaq was a single season of excavation in the early 1930s. It focused on recording the main architectural features of the fortress, but the later publication is a mere 20 pages of field report. The isolation of the site poses serious logistical challenges for us, but it is also a blessing in terms of preservation. Modern disturbance is limited, and the mud brick walls of the fortress still stand to a height which allows us to not only see the layout of the buildings, but also appreciate the actual spaces they generated. In this image, for instance, you can still recognize the narrow alleyways which connected the individual components of the site. The hyper-arid climate also helped with the preservation of organic material. Much of the building timber survived, and we even find matting which the Middle Kingdom builders inserted into the mud brick walls. The same goes for other finds. We still have plenty of evidence which allows us to analyze how the occupants of the fortress lived and worked. Their tools, cooking pots, fragments of jewellery, and so on. But how do we study such a complex monument? Mapping the standing remains, obviously, is a first step to take. In the case of Shalfaq, we took 2,800 individual measurement points covering an area of about 4,000 square meters in order to generate a plan of the main architectural features. Shalfaq's enclosed area is about 1,800 square meters. With this, it is by far the smallest of the 12 Middle Kingdom fortresses. Thinking of Shalfaq as small gives us an understanding of the massive amount of resources which the pharaohs of this period invested into the fortification project. Today, Shalfaq's main enclosure wall still stands up to 8 meters high. As you can see in this image, it commands the view of the river. The digital elevation model illustrates the massive volume of these walls. Functionality aside, this architecture is a statement, a very common way for the ancient Egyptians to express and affirm their power. In our investigation, the next step was excavations. As digging is one of the most labor-intensive ways of archaeological inquiry, it needs to be done in a strategic way. We selected two promising areas to start with. The first is a wide open space outside North Gate. The 1930s excavations had indicated architectural remains there, but lacked details. This is how the area looked when we started to work there. We exposed a large open courtyard with scant remains of mud brick pavement, a clear indication of a workshop area. South of it, we recorded mud brick architecture, which we can likely reconstruct as 3 long, narrow rooms. This shape indicates the function as storage spaces. Adjacent to these rooms, we exposed the foundations of a large terrace structure, unfortunately not even preserved up to the original floor level. Thus, it remains unclear which kind of building it had originally supported. What we could show, however, was that the area experienced several changes in layout, including a reorientation of the entrance, all very close in date to its original construction. This tells us that the area was intensely used and that the occupants adjusted it to their individual needs. Because of its deflated nature, this area only produced few finds. Easily the most significant is this rather inconspicuous ceiling. It derives from a letter, that is, a papyrus scroll. As its imprint specifies, the sender was the office of the Egyptian vizier in Thebes, some 500 kilometers to the north. We do not know the business of the correspondence, as the actual papyrus letter has been lost. But the vizier is the chief administrator of the Egyptian state, so the dealings must have been important. A second, even more inconspicuous find gives us a hint towards their potential nature. Apart from deterring the Kushite kings and the populations of the Middle Nile Valley, the fortresses had a second function. They served to control the access to the gold-bearing regions in the desert east of the Nile Valley. This unassuming object is actually a gold weight, just under 12 grams. In the Middle Kingdom, 12 to 14 grams was the standard unit of weight for gold, the so-called small deben. From the presence of the weight in Shalfag, we can conclude that gold was processed in the fortress prior to being transported to Egypt. Let's now look at the second area of excavation. This targeted a building just inside South Gate. The layout of this block clearly signals its function as the granary of the fortress. Our excavations so far exposed the office chambers in the east and one small storage space next to them. We knew that the building had been excavated in the 1930s, so our big question was, would we still find any botanical remains? We carefully collected all the remaining sediment and transported it to the river for flotation. Flotation is a process by which we separate macro remains from the surrounding sediment matrix. Thank God in this case our exercise was worth the effort. We managed to extract relevant samples, which we then exported to London for further analysis. So this is the point where I want to jump back to UCL, turning to the lab side of things. All in all, fieldwork usually amounts to less than 10% of the archaeological work. Most of the analysis happens post-excavations, at the desk and in the labs. The finds and samples we collect in the field regularly become the material for dissertations and follow-up research projects undertaken by our students and graduates in London. In terms of the botanical remains from Shalfag, we have in the meantime confirmed that the granary had contained barley and wheat. Those were the two ancient Egyptian staple cereals used to produce beer and bread, so no surprises there. But the samples also included nabat berries and seeds of watermelons, and we hadn't been aware that granaries had been used also to store this produce. One thing to know about the melons at that time is that they were not eaten as fruit, but exploited for their seeds, which were a common snack and as such present also at Shalfag. Let's now turn to the other material. The beams and the mats, integrated in the mud brick walls, acted as tension anchors much in the same way as steel reinforcements which are inserted in present-day concrete constructions. The timber used in Shalfag all seems to be local acacia. The mats were mainly made of halfa grass, the most common species on the river banks. Besides this, sedges were also present in small quantities. These findings do not only help us to learn more about Middle Kingdom military architecture and building technology, they also illustrate how the builders of the fortress made use of the local environment. A similar exploitation of local resources could also be ascertained for other types of materials. Tools and gadgets like our gold weight were mostly made from a very specific local hard stone, which also indicates manufacture on the site instead of importation from Egypt. Interestingly, the same goes even for the wall paint on the fortress. Work by our PhD student Kate Fulcher showed that the specific composition of this paint is unknown from Egypt proper. We were lucky to come across a proper painter's workplace outside of the fortress walls, complete with a potsherd used for processing white and yellow paint. The analysis of these samples is ongoing, but first results suggest that the raw material for this paint was also sourced locally. Another MA dissertation at our institute by Anna Sunneborn Gudnadottir investigated the nature of the mud bricks used in the construction of the fortress. Anna showed that a very deliberate, light type of bricks, which mainly appears in the commander's house, does not have any clear functional advantages. Instead, these bricks seem to have been mainly used for visual effect and display. Anna proved that their ingredients were more difficult to procure. Thus we could argue that this made their production more labor-intensive, and hence their use potentially more prestigious. These examples show how the Shelfag project allows us, team members, staff and students, to be literally in touch with history, not only at the site, but also in our labs in London. So, to conclude, what is the narrative evolving from this research, and how does it tie in with our teaching programs at UCL? Let's turn to our map for a moment. I indicated Shelfag and Thebes from where the letter was sent, presumably to our fortress commander. Thebes was not the Egyptian capital in the Middle Kingdom. This was further downriver, at the entrance to the Fayoum. But still, Thebes would have been the location where much of the administrative business of the frontier zone was organized. South of Shelfag, we have Kerma, the capital of the Kushite kingdom, a mere 200 kilometers away from our fortress. But there's a bias in this bird's-eye view. Despite actual distances, in many ways the Egyptian soldiers in Shelfag would have been much closer to Thebes, their homeland, representing a culture and a landscape they knew. This is also where potentially the barley, the wheat and the melons for Shelfag would have come from. But still, the builders and soldiers of Shelfag expertly exploited the resources surrounding their fortress. This is a dimension which earlier, more Egyptocentric research would have completely ignored. Sites like Thebes and Shelfag will be places you learn about when you do a BA with us. Expanding our curriculum to Sudan adds sites like Kerma in the Middle Nile Valley to our teaching program. In our courses, we will, for instance, explore the expressions of Egyptian power in images and texts, like the boundary stele on the left side of this slide. It comes from Semna, the southernmost Middle Kingdom fortress 10 kilometers south of Shelfag. In year 2 of the degree, you will study Middle Egyptian language, and after this, you will be able to read the inscription on the Semna stele and the Egyptian names of the fortresses. In our courses, we will also discuss the history of ancient Egypt and its dynasties. You will also learn to unpick the data from scientific analysis of archaeological material, like the results of our C14 datings from Shelfag. The dates in this image tell the story about how occupation at the site continued beyond the time of Senusret III and the Middle Kingdom. Around 1550 BC, in the early New Kingdom, The site was shortly revived in a series of military campaigns of the Egyptians, which eventually spelled the end of the Kerma kingdom. Throughout the degree, you will also acquire skills in handling and analyzing archaeological objects. With regard to Egypt and Sudan, we will, for instance, explore the multiple dimensions of material culture as a marker and expression of ethnicity. This image illustrates finds from Shalfak, which we recognize as belonging to local cultural traditions. They tell us about non-Egyptian inhabitants or personnel in the fortress. We learn about shared foodways and cooking, and about a deposit of jewelry which was only worn by nomadic populations in the eastern desert, which constitute another group of actors in this historical context. In sum, our BA interweaves UCL's long-standing strength in Egyptology with a sound archaeological basis and new research directions. We would love to welcome you to our program, and if you have any questions or want to have further information, please contact me or visit us online.